there, the Keynesian heresy was circulated to the other government departments. It helped that Curry had now gone to the White House and could send the converted around to the key places. Maybe not to all of the Federal Triangle, but certainly here to the Treasury and to the Labor Department. This was no conspiracy, it was the spread of wisdom. Gradually the ideas became established, but the practice still lagged behind. Throughout the 1930s, government intervention to lift the level of employment remained half-hearted. In 1939, the last year of peace in Europe, 9.5 million Americans were still unemployed, 17% of the labor force. The war then brought the Keynesian remedy with a rush. Expenditures doubled and redoubled, and so did the federal deficit. And by 1942, unemployment was gone, labor was becoming scarce. There's another way of looking at this history. It could be said that Hitler, having ended unemployment in Germany, had gone on to end it in the rest of the industrial world. In any case, one now saw one of the enduring features of the Keynesian revolution: the difference between spending for welfare and spending for war. In the Depression years, modest spending for the unemployed had caused the gravest alarm. Now expenditures many, many times greater for weapons and soldiers were perfectly safe. The war, falling unemployment, brought a new threat: rising prices, rising wages, inflation. For this, too, Keynes had a remedy. Put everything into reverse. Raise taxes to keep pace with wartime spending. Try by all possible means now to keep down the budget deficit. Keep the cost of living stable, if necessary, by subsidies, and then ask labor to forego wage increases for the duration. Confine price control and rationing to essentials, those things in especially short supply. I circulated a paper with a similar set of proposals here in Washington. I'd been summoned to town by Curry. It was for me an act of economic plagiarism of considerable importance, because in the spring of 1941, I was put in charge of price control, one of the most powerful economic positions of the wartime years. I have to tell you that I was overjoyed. I got the news here in the Blaine Mansion, which was the first headquarters for wartime price control. I started here with around 15 staff members. Soon we outgrew these quarters and had to move, and during the war we had to move 3 times in all. We ended up in this size of a acreage. By then, for prices, rent, rationing, we had, Washington and country, some 17,000 employees. I was never clear who hired them all. It was from this desk that prices were fixed in World War II. Ultimately, with minor exceptions, all of the prices in the United States. There could be appeal to higher authority, but the appeals were not taken in very many cases because higher authority backed us up. I've said many times that if anyone left the office with a smile, we felt that we hadn't done our job. To be effective, price control had to be painful. Those appealing for price increases came to this table. Those with the worst case always made the most eloquent plea. Knowing that their case was fraudulent, they had, I suppose, rehearsed it the most times. We usually had figures on their earnings, and I would look down the table while someone was pleading the case for higher prices and notice that staff members would be moving their fingers like this on the edge of the table. The reference was to a fable, the year of the great famine in the land of the ants. One day a patrol from an ant colony
on the side of a steep hill, found food, a lovely piece of horse manure. It was directly up the slope from the colony, and all the ants were mustered out to bring the food. They rolled it down the hill, and presently it was rolling faster and faster, and threatening to roll right by the ant colony and be lost. The queen ant went up and down the lines, encouraging her troops who were holding against the food, encouraging them to ever greater exertions. Her antennae were going up and down like this, and thus our signal. It is ant language, and it means, stop that horse shit. It was while I was directing price control that I first met Keynes. I'd gone to Cambridge to study under him in 1937, 1938, but that was the year of his first heart attack. He came into the outer office one day, unannounced, to deliver a paper. My secretary brought it in, said he seemed to feel he should see me. The name, she said, was Keynes. I looked at the paper. There it was, J.M. Keynes. The paper was a lucid condemnation of the prices that we were setting on corn and hogs. He called them maize and pigs. And to this day I remember my feeling. It was as though St. Peter had dropped in on some parish priest. It was also in these offices, alas, that we discovered the shortcomings of Keynes, when and how his ideas did not work.
Long before all workers had jobs, firms could raise prices, and they did. And wages could and did rise. This led in turn to the price-wage or the wage-price spiral. We also learned that taxes could not be made to keep pace with wartime spending, and that the excess of purchasing power could not, as Keynes had proposed, be mopped up. One firm's prices were another firm's costs, and you could not hold one man's prices if his costs went up. So some general action was imperative.
Previously, I had argued against a general ceiling on prices with great conviction. Now I found myself arguing for it with almost equal passion, maybe more passion. I also noticed that almost no one else observed how completely I had changed my mind. The new policy worked, and I concluded that in economics, it's far, far wiser to be right than it is to be consistent. The great lesson of the war was here. The Keynesian remedy was asymmetrical. It would work against unemployment and depression. It did not work in reverse against inflation. And this is a lesson that now, more than 30 years later, the disciples of Keynes are still reluctant to accept. But now Keynes, who was once a heretic, is now the prophet of the established faith. And the faithful are still waiting for his remedies against inflation to work.
Keynes himself did not stay to reflect on this failure. At Paris, he had fought the Carthaginian peace. In 1925, he had fought Churchill and the tyranny of gold. Now in 1944, delegates from 44 countries assembled here in New Hampshire. The purpose was to see that the errors on gold and on reparations on which Keynes had made his reputation were not repeated. The Bretton Woods Conference was not a conference between nations. It was really a conference of nations with Keynes. The result was the Bank for International Reconstruction and Development and the International Monetary Fund. The first would guide the minds of the victorious powers to reconstruction, not punishment, and